The Roll of Honour of the Watsonian War Dead. First World War. John Adams. Robert Affleck. John Ainsley. William Ainsley. John Aitchison. Scott Aitchison. William Aitken. William Ayton. John Alexander Elliot Alexander. John Petrie Alexander. Thomas Alexander. Arthur Allen. Charles Allen. William Allen. Frederick Allison. James Allison. Alexander Anderson. David Anderson. Frederick Kinloch Anderson. Frederick William Anderson. James Anderson. Walter Kinloch Anderson. Walter Zerub Bailey Anderson. Napier Armitt. Henry Armstrong.
John Ashcroft. Dermot Bailey. Archibald Bain. Albert Baker. Alfred Baker. Roy Balmain. Charles Banks. William Barber. Marshall Barclay. William Barry. Thomas Bartleman. William Bartleman. Andrew Baxendine. John Baxendine. Henry Barnett. William Beatty. Frank Beadle. Alfred Bell. Charles Bell. David Bell. John Gibson Bell. John Murray Bell. James Muir Black. James Black. William Black.
William Blackhall. Andrew Blair. John Blake. Robert Blythe. John Bone. William Bonnar. James Bowhill. John Bowie. Jack Brebner. Alan Bremner. Archibald Bridges. Hugh Broadway. Neville Broadway. Alexander Brown. Arnold Brown. George Brown. George Brownlee Brown. James Brown. William Gordon Brown. William Nimmo Brown. George Brown. William Brownlee. George Bruce. Vincent Bruce.
Robert Bryson. Leslie Buchan. John Budge. Joseph Burns. William Burt. William Bush. James Butty. James Byers. Robert Cadzo. Ernest Caird. Williams Cairn. Alexander Calder. William Calderwood. James Alistair Gordon Cameron. James Ritchie Cameron. Robert Cameron. William Cameron. Donald Campbell. William Campbell. Duncan Cargill. Francis Carlton. William Chisholm. Dugald Christie. William Christie. Charles Clark.
George Mackay Clark. George Murray Clark. Smollett Clerk. George Cochrane, Ian Cochrane, Cecil Coles, Daisy Coles, Lionel Coles, John Considine, Patrick Considine, Cecil Cook, Robert Copland, James Cooper, Robert Coots, Lewis Cowan, Neil Cowan, Archibald Cow, William Cowie, Robert Craig, George Cranston, William Crawford, Donald Crerar, Charles Crichton, James Crichton, Austin Kroll.
John Crockett, William Crombie, James Craig, John Cullen, Charles Cunningham, Hugh Cunningham, John Cunningham, Adam Curry, Robert Curry, Neil Darker, Walter Davies, John Davison, William Davison, Reginald Dawson, Lancelot Dean, William Dees, James Dick, Ernest Dingwall, Harry Dippy, George Dobby, William Dobby, James Doig, Alexander Don, Fred Don, Archie Donaldson.
John Dougal, Charles Douglas, Ronald Ross Douglas, William Douglas, John Dowell, Robert Drummond, William Drummond, James Dudgeon, Charles Dugan, John Duncan, William Duncan, David Dunn, Willoughby Dunn, Christian Dunlop, Ronald Esterbrook, Arthur Edmonston, Edward Elliot, James Elliot, Johann Fairgrieve, Alexander Fairley, William Fairley, William Falconer, Roderick Ferguson, George Fleming, James Fleming.
Christopher Flint, Leslie Forbes, Charles Ford, George Ford, Archibald Forrest, Bertram Forrest, James Forrester, Herbert Forster, Rutherford Fortune, Herbert Fraser, Malcolm Fraser, Edwin Fry, Andrew File, William Gall, Herbert Gammy, John Gellatley, Robert Gellatley, Alexander Gemmell, William Gemmell, James Gerard, Robert Gerard, Alexander Gibb, Arthur Gibb, George Gibson, Reginald Gibson.
Robert Gibson, Douglas Gillespie, Andrew Gillison, David Gilmore, Charles Glegg, William Good, Alexander Gorey, James Gorry, Samuel Gover, Ian Gowan, James Graham, James Grant, Percy Grant, Benjamin Gray, Charles Gray, David Gray, Francis Gray, James Greenhorn, Ronald Gunn, William Gunn, George Guthrie, John Haddo, John Haggart, Arthur Haldane, John Hamilton.
Thomas Hamilton, Alexander Hare, Frederick Harley, Herbert Hartley, Aubrey Hawkes, John Hay, Robert Hay, David Henderson, James Henderson, Ralph Hendry, Oswald Hurd, Bernard Hereford, Geoffrey Hereford, David Heron, John Hill, Robert Hogg, Herbert Honeyman, James Hood, Thomas Hood, Hugh Hops, Henry Horrocks, Alfred Ourston, George Ourston, George Howison, James Huggan.
Henry Huey, William Hume, David Hunter, George Hunter, George Arnold Hunter, Harry Hunter, Moram Hunter, William Hunter, Harry Hutchison, Frederick Hislop, James Inch, Robert Inch, Maurice Inglis, John Ingram, Charles Isles, David Jack, Guy Jack, John Jackson, James Jackson, Alexander Jameson, Crawford Jamieson, Arthur Jardine, James Johnston, Robert Jolly, Alexander Kay.
George Kay, John Kay, James Kearney, George Kelly Lawson, Charles Kemp, James Kemp, James Wallace Kennedy, James Gordon Kennedy, Malcolm Kerr, David Kerr, David Chesney Kerr, Henry Kerr, Robert Kilpatrick, Alexander Knox, Frank Kidd, James Laidlaw, Hugh Laird, John Lamb, Frank Lawrence, James Lawrence, William Lawson, John Leckie, George Lees, David Layton, Ernest Lade.
Charles Lindsay, William Linklater, Thomas Lockie, Robert Logan, Edward Longden, Neumann Lothian, Francis Love, William Lowe, William Lowson, William Luca, John Lyburn, James Lyle, George McAllister, William Macbeth, John MacDiarmid, Angus MacDonald, Arthur MacDonald, Malcolm MacDonald, Somerled MacDonald, Ian McFarlane, William Cargill Stuart McFarlane, William Smith McFarlane, William Walter McFarlane, Donald Argyle Douglas Ian McGregor, Donald Hamilton McGregor.
James Mackindo, Ian Mackay, Mark Mackay, David Mackenzie, John Mackenzie, Robert Mackenzie, Reginald Mackey, William Mackey, Edward McIntosh, Angus MacLeod, Eden MacLeod, James McMaster, James McMeekin, Archibald McPherson, Robert McPherson, Robert Duncan Mearns McPherson, Duncan McCrae, Lewis McCrae, Murdoch McTaggart, Herbert Mays, Arthur Mann, John Martin, Ross Martin, George Marwick, William Masterton.
James Maybin, Clement MacArthur, Archibald McCall, Donald McCallum, Duncan McCall, George McCrae, Charles McCrosty, Edward McDougall, George McEwen, Arthur McGregor, Donald McGregor, James McIntyre, Donald MacLeod, Henry MacLeod, William McCrae, David McRither, Norman McRury, James McTavish, David Stewart McGregor, Charles Meester, when was it Meister, isn't it? Sorry, okay. Ernest Meldrum, James Melrose, David Melville, Harry Melville, Archibald Menzies.
Norman Mill, Alexander Miller, George Inglis Miller, George William Miller, Archibald Miller, John Miller, Robert Miller, Thomas Miller, William Miller, Robert Milne, Eric Milroy, Reginald Minto, Douglas Mitchell, John Mitchell, Norman Mitchell, Robert Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell, Ian Molyneux, James Moncur, William Moncur, James Monroe, Eric Moore, Archibald Morrison, Eric Morrison, James Morris.
Alexander Morrison, James Bow Morrison, James William Morrison, John Morrison, Andrew Muir, James Muir, George Muir, Henry Mulligan, Alexander Murray, James Andrew Murray, James Brass Murray, Robert Murray, George Naismith, David Nichol, William Nicholson, Adam Nimmo, John Nisbet, Pollock Nisbet, John Niven, John O'Sullivan, John Orme, George Overton, Alexander Park, Archibald Park, Norman Patterson.
Francis Patrick, Hugh Patterson, James Pearson, John Peaty, Charles Peden, David Peffers, Ellis Pitcairn, William Porteous, William Henry Gray Porteous, James Prentice, Charles Price, Owen Price, Arthur Pringle, Douglas Pritchard, George Purves, Albert Piper, George Rain, Charles Rayson, Alexander Rates, John Ramsey, Ernest Rankin, John Rankin, Donald Reed, Robert Reed, John Rennie.
Thomas Angus Ridgely, John Ritchie, Lewis Ritchie, Richard James Wallace Ritchie, Robert Ritchie, Alexander Robertson, Athol Robertson, John Robertson, Lennox Robertson, William Robertson, James Rogerson, George Ronaldson, John Ronaldson, William Rose, William Moore Rose, Harry Rosenblum, Alexander Ross, Finley Ross, James Ross, Ian Russell, William Russell, Robert Rutherford, William Sedler, Alexander Sanderson, Robert Scarlett.
Charles Sclater, Henry Scott, Alexander Scougal, Frank Scougal, James Selkirk, Howard Seaton, Ian Shannon, James Shaw, John Shaw, Tom Shaw, William Shaw, William Shepherd, William Sheriff, Harry Shortreed, James Sidey, William Skinner, Thomas Skirving, John Slater, Gordon Smart, Adam Smith, Alexander Smith, James Smith, John Smith, Lawrence Smith, Sidney Smith.
William Smith, John Southern, Andrew Spears, Robert Squire, Robert Steele, William Steele, Herbert Stenhouse, James Stewart, Frederick Stevenson, John Stevenson, Tom Stevenson, Alexander Stewart, Douglas Stewart, George Stewart, Ralph Stewart, Tudor Stobie, Robert Alexander Stewart, William Stewart, Robert Graham Stewart, Charles Sutherland, John Sutherland, George Swan, Robert Swan, David Sword, George Syme.
Ian Taylor, Thomas Taylor, William Templeton, Frederick Fallon, John Fallon, Alexander Thompson, Charles Thompson, George Thompson, John Thompson, Patrick Thompson, Robert Thompson, William Thompson, William Thompson, James Thorburn, William Thorburn, Henry Turnbull, Ernest Turner, Alexander Urquhart, William Urquhart, Claude Van Sumeren, Robert Vickers, Lionel Vinicombe, George Wade, George Waldy.
David Walker, John Walker, William Wallace, Clement Walter, Alistair Watson, Norman Watson, Robert Watson, William Erskine Watson, William J. Watson, Percy Watt, James Waters, Harold Matthews, William Webster, Robert Wedderburn, Jack Wedderspoon, Robert Weir, William Weir, Thomas Welsh, Robert Westwater, Alexander Westwood, George White, James Whitelaw, Charles Whittaker, Marshall White, Reginald Wilkes.
Archibald Wilson, Arthur Wilson, Conrad Wilson, Gordon Wilson, Henry Wilson, James Wilson, John Wilson, Lewis Wilson, Matthew Wilson, Robert Armstrong Wilson, Robert Forsyth Wilson, Robert Stratton Wilson, Frank Windle, James Wingate, James Wood, James Wiper, Andrew Young, Andrew George Young, Archibald Young, David Young, George Young, James Young, John Young, William Young.
And from the Second World War, William Aitken, Douglas Alexander, Anthony Alsbrook, Harold Baker, Dennis Barnes, Alan Barry, Alexander Bathgate, George Beattie, Thomas Beveridge, Colin Blair, Ripley Bogle, James Borland, Frank Brocci, James Brotherston, Alexander Slater Brown, Stuart Brown, Thomas Brown, Robert Budgett, Reginald Burge, Andrew Burney, David Caird, David Calder, David Cameron, Colin Campbell, Cameron Carnegie.
Stuart Carnegie, Peter Chain, William Christie, William Cogman, Thomas Craig, John Darling, Terry Davidston, Quintin Dawson, Alfred Dempsey, Adam Dempster, Robert Dixon, Alexander Doole, Stuart Duncan, Robert Dunlop, Walter Eckott, Alan Edgar, John Elliott, James Ewart, Robert Ewing, Thomas Ferry, George Falconer, Ian Farquharson, William Foote, Francis Ford, Peter Ford.
John Forrest, David Forrester, John Fotheringham, John Fulton, Harold Garden, Keith Gibson, Ronald Gilbert, John Gillis, George Glennie, Arthur Gordon, Samuel Gordon, Peter Gorey, Ernest Gouldy, John Haig, John Hall, William Haley, Donald Halsall, William Hamilton, John Hardy, Colin Hart, William Hart, John Hasty, James Hawkins, David Heggie, and Percy Honeyman.
David Hewson, Ian Hunter, James Hunter, Thomas Hunter, John Inglis, Ronald Inglis, Frederick Isaacs, John Jagger, David James, Ian Jameson, Douglas Johnson, Andrew Kiddy, Ian Laidlaw, Andrew Law, John Loftus, Herbert Love, Stuart Loudon, Maurice Lucas, Russell Lyon, Gervin McCall, Alan MacDonald, Colin MacDonald, Sandy MacDonald, Don McEwen, Eric McFarlane.
Kenneth McVeigh, Ian McGregor, John McIntosh, James McKellar, Eric Mackenzie, George Mackenzie, Ian Mackenzie, Robert McKenna, Huntley McKenna, Alistair McLachlan, Lachlan McLachlan, Alan McLean, John McLeish, William McMichael, Alistair McNeil, David McRuer, Patrick McPeace, Richard Morstead, Key Marshall, Douglas Marwick, John Melrose, Alexander Methven, Harry Miller, Alexander Moncrief, Alan Motherstill.
Gerald Mountford, John Reed Muir, Ian Mundy, Ian Munro, Hamish Munro, Alistair Murray, Lauder Nicole, Charles Orr, Alan Orr, David Page, Ian Park, James Patterson, Richard Payne, Andrew Penman, James Peary, Thomas Pollard, John Preacher, Peter Prentice, Andrew Renwick, Donald Reeside, William Richmond, James Ritchie, George Roberts, Kenneth Roberts, John Robertson,
Thomas Robertson, Patrick Ronaldson, Alexander Ross, Alan Ross, Michael Scanlon, Leonard Scott, Robert Scott, William Skur, James Shaw, Hugh Slight, Campbell Smith, Batten Smith, William Smith, John Smythe, Archibald Somerville, George Somerville, Dennis Somerville, William Stenhouse, Duncan Stewart, George Stewart, Ian Stewart, John Cranston Stewart, John Rattray Chalmers Stewart, Ian Stracy, Donald Strachman.
Alan Sumpton, Stuart Sutherland, Alistair Thompson, James Thorburn, David Tweedy, William Ermson, Raymond Valvona, Ian Veach, Bernard Wakeford, Herbert Watson, Ian Watson, John Bruce Watson, John Russell Watson, Stuart Watt, Peter Waugh, Michael Whelan, Stephen White, Henry Williamson, James Williamson, Thomas Wilson, Stanley Winton, James Younger, James Yule, and from the Korean War, Ian Reith. We will remember them.
The act of remembrance at the school war memorial that we have just witnessed commemorates the sacrifice of all those former pupils of George Watson's Boys College and Girls, who gave their lives in service of their country during the war of the 20th century. Earlier, we honored each one of them by reading their names from the Roll of Honor. The first act of remembrance took place at George Watson's College, then in Archibald Place, on the 11th of November, 1919, exactly 100 years ago this morning. In all, 599 men who had been pupils at George Watson's College, boys, and one woman, a former pupil of George Watson's Ladies' College, died during or as a result of the First World War.
They called the First World War the Great War. It was said to be the war to end all wars, but tragically, it proved to be no such thing. Only 20 years after the end of that war, the world was plunged into another conflict, and a further 202 Watsonians were to perish before peace returned in 1945. This morning, it is our duty and privilege to tell the stories of some of those who gave their lives in the war. By doing so, we also honor the hundreds of others who died and the thousands of others who served and returned, often having endured the unimaginable horrors of war. A popular hymn during and after the First World War was "Abide With Me." It's been sung at every FA Cup final since 1927. To many people in that crowd, singing it reminded them of lost friends and family.
We will now all sing "Abide With Me." The chamber choir will sing the first verse, and then we will all join in. Would you please stand? Please be seated.
The short period of peace between 1918 and 1939 was too short a time for the horrors of the First World War to be forgotten by those who had endured them. It was too short a time for families devastated by the conflict to recover. They still mourned their fathers, brothers, and sons, and sometimes their mothers, sisters, and daughters too. They struggled to care for those who returned maimed in body or in mind by what they had experienced. Often they lived in poverty due to the loss of the main breadwinner in the family. Their hopes for the future had been shattered, and nothing could restore them. Such was the death toll amongst young men in the First World War that many young women would now never marry or have children of their own. The time of peace was short, but cruelly, it was just long enough for the son of a father killed in the First World War to grow to maturity and to himself be killed in the Second.
Looking at the dates of the First World War, it would be easy to assume that by the end of 1918, the carnage was over. Whilst the guns had fallen silent on the 11th of November 1918, the death toll continued to grow. Many of those who returned from the war were to die months or even years later as a result of their service.
Alexander Gemmell was born in 1889 and attended Watson's from the age of 12 until he was 16. After graduating from Edinburgh University, he became an analytical chemist. Chemical weapons were deployed extensively during the First World War. In April 1915, chlorine gas was first used, causing soldiers to panic as they coughed, retched, and struggled to breathe. Later, even more lethal gases, such as phosgene and mustard gas, burned, blinded, or slowly killed their victims.
Trained chemists like Alexander Gemmell were needed to work on ways of combating these poisonous gases. He took command of an anti-gas school, training recruits how to respond in a gas attack. Then, in 1917, he transferred to the anti-gas department in London. Here, he worked with Lieutenant Colonel Edward Harrison, developing the smallpox respirator, a gas mask that became standard issue to Allied soldiers, and which led to a dramatic fall in gas-related deaths. However, by working with such dangerous chemicals, Alexander had compromised his own health. He suffered a hemorrhage and died on the 3rd of January, 1919, aged 29. Alexander Gemmell is honored by the Royal Institute of Chemistry because of his invaluable work, which led to advances in gas mask technology and so saved many thousands of lives. In the words of his commanding officer, he died on active service as much as any soldier in the field.
Born in 1885, James Gerard became a pupil at Watson's in 1895. In business as a merchant when war began, he joined the Army Service Corps, the unit responsible for keeping the British Army supplied with food, equipment, and ammunition. This was a huge undertaking. In 1 month alone, in 1918, over 30 million kilos of meat and nearly 41 million kilos of bread was needed to feed the Allied army fighting in France. James served in France and Belgium. He was commissioned as an officer in 1917 and was wounded in August 1918.
On his return to Edinburgh, he was admitted to Craiglockett Hospital, which today is the Craiglockett campus of Edinburgh Napier University. He stayed there for 6 months. Today, James would have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The hospital records then show him as suffering from neurasthenia, a diagnosis often given to officers who came from upper middle class backgrounds. Other ranks were given the less socially acceptable diagnosis of shell shock. James Gerard was discharged from the army as medically unfit and died in Craiglockett Hospital on the 13th of February 1919. He was 34 years old.
A number of Watsonians fought during World War I and survived, only to die during World War II. John Reed Muir was born in Ayrshire in 1873 and attended Watson's from 1886 to 1890 before going to Edinburgh University to study medicine. Graduating in 1894, he followed his love for the sea and joined the Royal Navy. He had a good war, serving as a fleet surgeon aboard the battlecruiser HMS Tiger and doing heroic work at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. He went on to be mentioned in dispatches twice and earned the French Croix de Guerre in 1917 for his distinguished service. John retired from the Royal Navy in 1924, having achieved the rank of Surgeon Rear Admiral and being elected to the Fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons, Edinburgh.
By 1939, when war broke out once more, John Reed Muir was living in Southampton. Too old to rejoin the Navy, he was nevertheless eager to serve his country, and with 4 other enthusiastic men of a similar age, he was given the personal permission of Winston Churchill to serve in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Churchill wrote on the recommendation certificate, "Promote them, age will be served." The men patrolled along the south coast of England on the watch for potential invaders using a civilian motor yacht, the Campeador. Thus, the legend of the gallant little Campeador was born, a legend which was immortalised in Cecil Hunt's book of the same name. The artist, Sir Muirhead Bone, even came aboard the boat to sketch the crew. The combined age of the officers was said to be 280. According to an article in the Times,
the ship soon acquired a high reputation of remaining on her station and refusing to return to port to remedy defects if these could possibly be fixed at sea. She was 84 days at sea out of the first 95 days of the war, and these gallant gentlemen, by their fortitude and unabated cheerfulness, were a splendid example to everyone.
but on the 22nd of June, 1940, the Campeador struck a mine in the English Channel. John Reed Muir was killed instantly, along with all the other members of her crew. He was 66 years old and was the oldest Watsonian to be killed in either of the 2 wars.
William Alexander McMichael was born in 1896 and enrolled at Watson's in 1901. He left in 1910 at the age of 16, initially deciding to become a dentist. On the outbreak of war in 1914, he put his plans on hold and enlisted as a private in the Royal Scots. However, life as an infantryman was not for him, and he transferred to the new Royal Flying Corps, serving as a pilot throughout the First World War in both France and Egypt. The life expectancy of pilots in the early days of flying was not great, even without the added hazards of warfare. But William McMichael fought bravely, being mentioned in dispatches on several occasions and rising to the rank of captain. William was 44 when the Second World War broke out. Like many Scots of his age and background, he had spent much of the interwar period employed in the lucrative rubber industry in what is now Malaysia, but was then the British colony of Malaya. There he admired his wife, Susan.
Initially exempt from compulsory service due to his age, but still keen to play his part, William McMichael applied to join the Royal Air Force, but was rejected, despite his exploits in the First World War. Eventually, William found himself serving as an ambulance driver in the Federated Malaysian States Volunteer Forces. In February 1942, Japan unexpectedly invaded the Malaysian peninsula, and a war of devastating ferocity was unleashed upon British and local forces, which then retreated to the stronghold of Singapore. However, Singapore also fell to the Japanese, and over 80,000 prisoners were taken and placed in various internment camps across Malaya. William McMichael was incarcerated in Changi Prison in Singapore.
The bleak conditions of Changi and the dehumanizing treatment of prisoners of war and internees made the camp infamous. Forced labor was the norm, beatings were a daily occurrence. And since prisoners had to work to earn food, death from starvation for those too weak to work was common. Diseases such as malaria and dysentery thrived in the dirty and cramped prison. No fewer than 51 Watsonians spent time in Changi. Then, as now, Watsonians enjoy fellowship around the world. They support each other and extend a hand to others in the spirit of Ex Cordi Caritas. So it was in Changi Prison. The activities of the Watsonian Club of Malaya, Changi Internment Camp, culminated in 1943 with a Watsonian Day dinner. The menu featured curry, sambals, and coffee, and toasts were proposed to the memory of George Watson and to the old school. Sadly, William McMichael did not live to enjoy Watsonian Day. He had died in January 1943, aged 47. He is buried in Kranji War Cemetery, northwest Singapore.
James Middlemass Thorburn was born in 1885 and attended Watson's from 1890, where he distinguished himself as a great rugby player. After leaving school, James joined a firm of builders and had excellent business prospects before him. He married his wife Jean on the 8th of July 1916, shortly before joining the 4th Royal Garrison Artillery, where he was later commissioned as an officer, rapidly rising to the rank of major. However, like William McMichael, James Thorburn was attracted by the opportunities of flying in the Royal Flying Corps, accepting a demotion to captain as a price for transferring to the much more glamorous but much more hazardous branch of the army. James Thorburn was killed on the 11th of February 1917 when his aircraft was brought down in flames behind enemy lines. His previous regiment, the 4th Royal Garrison Artillery, never saw action during the war. His transfer to the RFC had cost him much more than a demotion.
On the 10th of April, 1917, Jean Thorburn gave birth to their son. She named him James, in memory of the father he would never know. James Gordon Thorburn followed his father to Watson's in 1925, but left in 1929 to go to Dalhousie Castle before proceeding to Glenalmond, where he played in first 15. On leaving school, he entered an Edinburgh law firm and later graduated in law from the University of Edinburgh. Aged 22, at the outbreak of the Second World War, James joined the 4th Regiment of the Royal Horse Artillery and fought in the Battle of Greece. He died in Egypt in May 1941. The toll that war took on Jean Thorburn was a cruel one. She had lost her husband to one war and her only child to the other. And to compound the cruelty, the fortunes of war denied both her husband and her child even the dignity of a grave. Although they have no known grave, the names of both James Middlemas Thorburn and James Gordon Thorburn are inscribed on our school war memorial. Over them, the golden dome bears the inscription, "The whole earth is their tomb." This is a quote from an ancient Greek historian. "The whole earth is the tomb of heroic men, and their story is not given only on stone over their body, but abides everywhere, without visible symbol, woven into the stuff of others' lives."
On the 11th of November, 1919, the then headmaster of George Watson's Boys' College, Dr. Allison, presided over the first act of remembrance at the school. Later this morning, members of his family will plant a tree in front of the school to commemorate the service of those who returned after the war. In doing so, they will remind us that the stories of those about whom we have heard this morning are indeed woven into the stuff of all of our lives here at George Watson's College.
On the 11th of November, 1919, the drum corps of the school pipe band signalled the start of a minute's silence by sounding through the corridors where once had trod the feet of carefree boys. We will now recreate that moment exactly 100 years later. At the end of a minute's silence, a piper will play Reveille. Will you now please stand until requested once again to sit?
They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.